some supposed underclass, or some other form of hypothetical group or rationality, but a system that has throughout its history both defined racial groups and locked them into relations of domination and subordination. More specifically, to quote another scholar, we're detailing the system that is run by whites for the benefit of whites. Note that this also moves the term white supremacy away from the behavior and actions of white supremacists. Though we acknowledge both historically and in contemporary setting that the actions, the intimidation, the violence practiced by white nationalists are expressions of white supremacist ideology, our notion of white supremacy, as argued above, goes beyond behavioralist explanations for white domination. And in so doing, we are showing how white supremacy can be reproduced in the absence of racist intent. And so to that end, our project is similar to that of liberal egalitarian, feminist, and Marxist scholars, identifying and detailing the workings of an unjust socio-political system, patriarchy, class society, white supremacy, and ultimately working to upend it. Our analysis of white supremacy is structural and relational in the following ways. For starters, it properly conceives of inequality as a relational issue. Naturally, if one group is disadvantaged, then another group is, by definition, advantaged. And we also recognize, as the historical record shows, that the disadvantages encumbering Black and Indigenous peoples and people of color more generally are the consequences of public policy, both policy action and policy action, inaction and action. Second, our analysis focuses on the extrapersonal mechanisms that produce patterns of disadvantage and advantage. These mechanisms include, and certainly aren't limited to, exploitation, opportunity hoarding, claims making, and racial ideology. In other words, our analysis focuses on structural constraints. And so we'll discuss some of these mechanisms in greater detail. Let's start with exploitation, since it's perhaps the most obvious of the mechanisms. There are two forms of racial exploitation. There's racial exploitation in its paradigm form and racial exploitation in its legacy form. The paradigm case for racial exploitation, characteristic of the pre-civil rights era, involved the differential or inferior treatment of non-whites made possible by their social, political, and legal or juridical designation as less than full citizens, and indeed less than full humans, or full persons in the philosophical jargon. And we mean to include exclusion as a part of this differential and inferior treatment. So examples would include African Americans being conscripted into debt servitude via the sharecropping and criminal justice systems, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which among other things rendered Chinese immigrants ineligible for naturalization, the Social Security Act, which at its inception excluded some 80 to 90% of African Americans, and racial zoning, which prohibited the sale of homes to people of color in areas designated for white occupancy. And so you'll notice that all of these actions obviously produce economic effects that survive the change in people of color's legal status. So racial zoning is outlawed, Social Security is extended, anti-discrimination laws are passed, but the political economic consequences of those actions lead to a spatial and economic arrangement between Blacks and whites that is left intact, giving rise to the second form of exploitation, the legacy form of racial exploitation. And under the legacy form of racial exploitation, where the moral status of whites and non-whites is equalized, putatively at least, through legislative change, i.e. the civil rights movement, racial inequity arises not necessarily from naked discrimination, but through a disadvantaged material position that handicaps people of color by comparison with what counterfactually would have been the case had they been white, and thus not subject to racial exploitation in the first place. So the legacy form of racial exploitation is manifest in the widespread Black precarity, for example, resultant from the first system and the structural and pervasive and illicit white advantage that continues to constitute society's natural baseline, right? This automatic reproduction of white supremacy. And this baseline is best characterized by the enormous racial wealth gap that has survived every fundamental transformation of the United States through the Civil War and Civil Rights Movement to the present day. Now let's go on to the second and related mechanism, opportunity hoarding. So opportunity hoarding occurs when members of the social group acquire access to a resource that is valuable, renewable, and subject to monopoly control. And resources can be broadly construed in this sense. It's probably easiest to think of this in terms of segregation. So for example, you can think of white communities with access to amenities and parks and transportation and job networks, etc., that are almost exclusively reserved to white access. And you really can't call that anything else but opportunity hoarding. And so the relationship between exploitation and opportunity hoarding is actually quite complex. The two are mutually reinforcing. Opportunity hoarding facilitates further racial exploitation, and it's at the same time enabled by, in the first place, racial exploitation. And what I mean by that is that racial exploitation, say for example, racial zoning, as I just mentioned, or racial covenants, produces the conditions necessary for opportunity hoarding. And then opportunity hoarding then produces increasing returns, which can only be maintained through further exploitation, further exclusion. So as you can see, the housing market is actually a really good example of both forms of exploitation, the paradigm case of exploitation and the legacy form of exploitation operating still today, to this day, in tandem. So let's go on to the next mechanism, which is racial ideology. It's very easy to think of racial ideology in terms of, again, white supremacist ideology, explicitly kind of biologically, structured arguments about the inferiority of people of color, right? But racial ideology also, as we've learned in recent years, is manifest in colorblind ideology, right? So maybe there isn't racist intent or explicitly racist logic, but there was a refusal to acknowledge the need for corrective racial justice. And as such, there's this naturalization of white advantage, which is the result of historic and systemic racial exploitation. And so that would be another form. It's a refusal to actually engage in reparative planning, as I call it in another paper, or reparations in general. And so I'd be happy to talk about that more as well. I'm gonna now pass it over to Ed.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Rashad. So we're using this term as Rashad noted to talk about systems and structures. And as we investigated this idea, urbanists and urban planners and urban scholars deal with the issue of race a great deal. And there's been a lot of attention paid to racial issues, racial disparities, racial inequalities. But what we found missing from a lot of that conversation and a lot of that analysis was white people. That even at the stage of describing the problem, you think back to much of the 20th century. It was conceived of race was conceived of as, quote, the Negro problem, or sometimes now it's called the underclass problem. But what this does is essentially put the emphasis on the purported dysfunctionality of certain parts of society without actually scrutinizing white advantage and white positionality in this. So we felt that this constituted an incomplete understanding of racial inequality in American cities, and frankly, we would argue that it is one of the reasons why we have seen enduring racial inequality and problems, is because there has simply not been attention to the position of whites and the role of white advantage in all of this. And so we felt that the model of urban problems was simply underspecified, to use sort of a statistical term, and that we needed to understand whiteness more. And in fact, there are 3 or 4 elements of whiteness that we felt needed to be surfaced. And many of these Rashad has previewed for us and has mentioned. But the first of this is whiteness as exclusion. So there's a way of thinking about whiteness as certainly a line of demarcation separating those who are stigmatized, who are subject to dispossession, social disrespect, from others who are entitled to the protections of liberal democratic norms, et cetera, right? That whiteness exists because the other exists. And in that respect, whiteness really is exclusion. So there's this exclusionism in a kind of theoretical sense, but there's a real sort of practical dimensions of exclusion as well. When we think about public policy, we can think of and we can point to significant examples of how exclusionism has worked in public policy. We think about the great working class victories of the New Deal in the middle part of the 20th century, about the introduction of and the protection of minimum economic rights for workers, old age pensions, income security, labor laws that created rights for workers. All of these were implemented and some designed specifically to exclude people of color, most notably African Americans. That is to say, one of the prices that was paid by New Deal legislators to get their legislation passed was to give in to, at that point, the Southern Democratic bloc of votes in the Senate and in the House that essentially required New Deal legislation to perpetuate the racial hierarchy of the South and more generally of the nation at the time. And so all of these laws were fashioned in such a way as to exclude African Americans. For example, the labor laws excluded farm workers and domestic workers, the 2 industries that were dominated by people of color at the time. The GI Bill of Rights, which some people argue did more to produce the 20th century American middle class than any other piece of legislation, was implemented to exclude Blacks from many of its benefits. VA and FHA housing assistance was implemented in ways that were explicitly racist, that excluded African Americans, while at the same time creating the basis for wealth building among white households and among the emerging white middle class at the time. So that's an example of exclusion, whiteness as exclusion in our public policy. But as Rashad noted, perhaps the paradigmatic example of whiteness as exclusion is the creation of white communities and the exclusionary zoning, the existence of what are called sundown towns, or what were called sundown towns, where Blacks were not welcome as permanent residents. Et cetera. So we have this understanding of whiteness and its base in exclusionism. The second thing about whiteness that we want to focus on is the value of it. The idea that whiteness provides advantages to those who can count themselves as members. And that those advantages tend to perpetuate themselves. So we point to one scholar who talks about whiteness and likens it to an efficiently functioning racial cartel that monopolizes social and economic advantages, and through political power and legislative power perpetuates those advantages. And so here we are talking about hoarding, about the public policies that are in place that protect, that have over decades protected white communities, and the benefits of good schools, of returns to home ownership in neighborhoods that are experiencing rapid appreciation, et cetera. The racial wealth gap is probably the best measure of the value of whiteness, right? That white families hold more wealth than African-American families by a factor of about 10. And that is the case regardless of the income of households, right? So whiteness produces these material benefits, and they do so through access to mortgage loans, through access to home ownership, through access and limited access, I would say, to jobs, and the highest paying jobs in the marketplace as well. So there is value to whiteness that we want to think about and talk about. The third dynamic here is kind of paradoxical. It's what many people call the invisibility of whiteness. The notion that although whiteness is everywhere in our society, it is very infrequently discussed. So it's sort of simultaneously hard to see. And what this means, this idea of the invisibility of whiteness, gets to what Rashad mentioned earlier, which is our sort of normal baseline, what we regard as the kind of baseline conditions in American society are really white conditions, are conditions for white households. Once white supremacy was given legal standing, and it was backed by the authority of the government, and this happened, over 100 years ago, over a couple hundred years ago, over time that comes to be considered the legitimate and natural baseline, so that whites who have this advantage no longer see it as advantage, it's no longer analyzed as advantage, and so it's normalized for whites as the dominant group. Where whites grow up, the kind of education they get is seen as the standard for our society, and goes in unquestioned as a result. Whites will oftentimes disavow that advantage, or at the very least profess unawareness of it, and indeed may be unaware of it. Yet whites very consistently behave in ways that capitalize on that advantage, right? So I think that for most white people, there is an awareness of the steps necessary to take advantage of their positionality as whites in this particular society. The notion of white invisibility emerged during a period when the domination of whites was, for the most part, unthreatened. I would argue, and others argue as well, that the heightened rate of non-European immigration since the 1980s, the idea that within about 20 or 30 years, we will no longer be a 50% plus white nation, the election of a Black president for 2 terms, all of those have combined to threaten this notion of white domination, and have therefore, I think, over the last 10, 15 years, produced a more conscious white identity politics. And there is social science evidence to this effect. That is, studies of survey results over the past 10, 15 years show that more and more whites are identifying themselves as white, as having specific interests because they are white. This is a growing phenomenon, this kind of white identity politics. And I do think that it's a fairly compelling explanation for the emergence of Trump. And it's not really coincidental in those terms. Nevertheless, most of the social science evidence shows that this overt white identity is still a minority phenomenon among whites. That is, most whites still do not possess this kind of overt consciousness of whiteness and their interests as white people, and their desire to defend the benefits and the advantages of whites. Another example, though, or another implication of the invisibility of whiteness is the notion, is the equation of the very concept of race with people of color. So on the slide in front of you, you have something that's really fairly common in social science. This is a diagrammatic depiction of dissimilarity indices, that is segregation indices. And you can see part of the title, it's the dissimilarity indices for racial and ethnic groups. Well, what's missing there? What's missing there are white people, all right? So what we have the index for blacks, we have the index there for American Indians, for Asians, for Native or Hawaiians, etc., right? All of these indices are as compared to white people, all right? So white people are the invisible background against which the patterns of quote unquote racial and ethnic groups are being judged, as though white is not a racial color or racial category, as though whiteness is somehow outside of the concept of race. And furthermore, that whiteness is the normal condition, and we need to look at everyone else compared to whites. What you don't see here is what social scientists now know, which is that whites are the most segregated racial ethnic group in the United States, right? And yet they don't appear in these kinds of indices normally. They appear as the reference group only. And what this does is, in addition to sort of hiding the patterns of white people and white residential choices, it also devalues communities of color. It problematizes those communities, establishing white neighborhoods as the ideal, as the standard, and as the normal and sort of superior form of racial, of residential patterning. So we regard the invisibility of whiteness as a problem. I think also our natural or neutral white space ends up being the kind of comparison against which the dysfunction of Black ghettos or Hispanic barrios are judged, right? And I also would probably, we argue that the invisibility of whiteness is often reinforced in the way that policymakers and analysts refer to the inequality that is produced, right? And here again, we make reference back to the Negro problem. But also a good example from my field, the field of housing, is, analysts do look at the gap in housing wealth. And there's one notable scholar or analyst anyway who talks about it, and he talks about the relative lack of property value appreciation in Black neighborhoods as the segregation tax, which I think is very evocative of inequality. But it also sort of helps to obscure the whiteness. If we talked about this as a segregation dividend and talked about it as producing unfair wealth advantages to whites, that would reorient our analysis a bit, right? In ways that I think are important and useful, in ways that we think are important and useful. So that's the invisibility of whiteness. The last sort of pattern that we look at is what we call the durability of whiteness. So, you know, we find ourselves in what some people call the post-civil rights era, where we have formally and legally outlawed forms of racial discrimination. We have the Fair Housing Act that outlaws discrimination in housing. We have the Brown versus Board of Education decision that has provided for integration of schools and at least the outlawing of separate but equal in schools. We have this kind of formal equality. We have equality in jobs and employment, right? We have laws against discrimination there. But we have obviously persisting inequalities and disparities in all of these areas, right? We have disparities in home ownership. We have disparities in housing conditions. We have disparities in educational experiences. We have disparities in employment, in incomes, in wealth, right? And so the durability of whiteness really really tries to highlight the ways in which white advantage continue and endure regardless of the legal context and framework that we find ourselves in. So even looking at Brown versus Board of Education and the Fair Housing Act, two of the milestone achievements of the civil rights era, we can see how they were very importantly limited by whiteness. So we had the original decision in the Brown versus Board of Education that said that we need to desegregate our schools. We need to integrate schools. Followed very shortly thereafter by the second Brown versus Board of Education decision, which says, well, yeah, we need to desegregate schools, but we should do so, quote, with all deliberate speed, end quote, right? And there it was. There was the signal to white massive resistance that our desegregation didn't have to happen tomorrow, right? We don't necessarily need to do this right away. We don't necessarily need to do it right away where it's not going to be accepted. We need to ease into this. Well, what that led to, of course, was decades of resistance and snail-like progress in actual desegregation of our schools. And I'm not a school policy expert, but I've read studies that show that we've stopped making a lot of progress in this area, and that in fact rates of school segregation may actually be reverting back to levels that we experienced in the 50s and the 60s. The Fair Housing Act provides another great example. This was, again, one of the landmark achievements of the civil rights era. It was passed by Congress in 1968, although I think it's instructive that it failed in Congress for 3 years prior to the assassination of Martin Luther King, and then was passed within 3 weeks of his assassination because the streets of America were aflame in protests over his assassination. And so it was passed in part to try to diffuse that situation, but it did pass. And so what about it was a nod to whiteness and the prerogatives of whites. And I think although scholars have pointed to a number of compromises that were made to get the law passed, I will focus on only one, and that is what's called the Mrs. Murphy exemption. Mrs. Murphy is a fictional older single white lady who owns her home or owns her duplex or triplex. And the lawmakers didn't want to tell Mrs. Murphy that she couldn't sell to anyone she didn't want to sell to. So in fact, the Mrs. Murphy exemption exempted all owner-occupied housing, 1 to 4 unit owner-occupied housing, from the provisions of the law. Well, this was an enormous exception in the housing stock, where the lawmakers said, you know, feel free to continue selling and renting to whomever you so desire, because you are outside the reach of the Fair Housing Act. So we can look at other policy areas, the racialized war on drugs, our sentencing policies, mass incarceration. All of these things are adaptive ways of maintaining the durability of white advantage and white position in our society. So the durability of whiteness, I think, requires an understanding of how our systems, how our policies are in place to carry on systems of racial subordination, to carry on systems that reproduce hierarchy and inequality. And so that, in fact, we can have white supremacy without racism. We can have white supremacy without white supremacists, although we do have plenty of white supremacists. Make no mistake about that. And so we are there. We use these ideas and others that I'll hand it back to Rashad. And I realize I took too much time in explaining these, to sort of use as our foundation for this course. Rashad, go ahead.
All right, so I want to talk about why it's so important for us to actually investigate white supremacy, how it operates, and how it's maintained. So I'm going to give some examples from the urban planning literature, urban and regional planning, I should say. And I want to start by saying that, as the quote earlier in a previous slide showed, normative questions hinge not only on rival values, but on rival factual claims. And so another way of saying that is a prescription depends on a diagnosis, right? And so we better be damn sure that we get the diagnosis right, the factual picture correct. And so here's an example from the planning literature on what urban planning is defined as. Planning is collective action for the common good, but particularly action that concentrates on building and shaping the shared physical infrastructure for present needs and future growth. Pluralism is perhaps the best way to begin to describe the American planning tradition. And this author continues on to say, as we shall see, and keep in mind, he's talking about 18th century United States and 19th century United States as he's doing his historiography. As we shall see, the wonders of the American planning tradition almost invariably take place outside any well-defined administrative structure. They are the product of ad hoc commissions, special authorities, private-public partnerships, all of which tend to blur the lines between the private and the public. I actually agree with that second part, and I'll get to why. But this is an example of how white supremacy remains invisibilized conceptually and ideologically, and in terms of our evaluative content. We have national myths of origin. We have myths of origins pertaining to specific fields and practices. And it's astonishing to me that planning, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, could ever be conceived as something that is rooted in pluralism and a cooperative venture for mutual advantage. And so looking at this in a separate paper, I've written about how this period of planning, and indeed planning today, is better characterized as a form of racial planning, in which spaces are racialized, and the way that we distribute goods and services, and then also externalities, where we decide to locate incinerators or toxic waste, what have you, is patterned by a racial calculus, right? And this is the entire point of the environmental racism, or the movement against environmental racism. And so why I say I agree with the second point, though, that the lines between public and private are blurred in the planning context, is because when you look at the history of housing, when you look at the history of race in this country, obviously that's the case with police colluding with civil society, white civil society, to oust Black people and other undesirable people of color from their communities through, terror mobs, any number of riots. And of course, prior to the 1950s, racial riots were associated with white people more than Black. And of course, in the 60s, that starts to become conceived differently. But certainly planning is this coordination between both the public, civil society, and the private. Let's move on to the next. That work? All right, and so interestingly enough, in this history on planning, this particular book, there are no terms, there's no appearance of these following terms: settler colonialism, white supremacy, genocide, slave markets, slave ports, slave trade, Chinese exclusion, exploitation, expropriation. Expropriation is actually mentioned, but none of it is with reference to indigenous peoples, ironically enough. And so what we'll be talking about in the class is this dialectic of planning, as another scholar called it. Planning's potential for progressive reform on the one hand, and its potential for regressive social control on the other hand. And we're particularly interested in its potential for regressive social control. The fact that, again, goods and services are distributed along socioeconomic lines, right? Particularly racial ones. The fact that planning conforms to certain cultural forms and logics, right? At the expense of others. And so that's what we'll be discussing in the class. I'm gonna pass it back over to Ed.
Great, thanks, Rashad. So we developed this course again because we felt that although a lot of courses at the Humphrey School that we make available to our public policy students, to our urban planning students, a lot of them deal with the issue of race. It's not clear that many, if any of them, adopt this framework that we think is important. So we've created this course. It meets Fridays at 9 a.m. For 2 3/4 hours, and it runs from the 11th of September to the 11th of December. We have decided in this era to offer it only online, and so that's that. What we plan to do in the course is, after sort of setting the stage, if you can advance the slide, yeah. After setting the stage for our deliberations, we will really look at what we think is the operation of white supremacy in a whole range of urban policy domains. The idea is that our framework is that American cities emerged in the way they did and look the way they do because of systems of white supremacy. And American cities continue to operate in ways that maintain and perpetuate patterns of white supremacy. And so we're going to take a look at various domains of policy, including land use, well, the ones that you see listed there. And we will cover, the racial origins of zoning itself, but also the idea of racial zoning. We will look at restrictive deeds, exclusionary zoning, single family zoning. For those of you who live in Minneapolis, and the roles of those policy tools in this context. We will look at housing, the operation of the FHA programs, public housing. We'll look at the phenomenon of redlining, the use of contract for deeds, and how that continues to bleed wealth from communities of color. We will look at different forms of housing discrimination, the Fair Housing Act. We will look at a phenomenon called predatory inclusion, in addition to, of course, predatory lending, et cetera. We will investigate urban renewal, or what was called the Negro Removal Program in the mid part of the 20th century. The displacement of communities of color, cultural displacement, redevelopment, and dispersal of low-income people and people of color. We will look at lending disparities, this segregation tax or segregation dividend that I mentioned earlier, how property ownership actually helps to build wealth for white families, but does not do so for African American families or Hispanic families, et cetera. We will look then at the creation of the white middle class and how that's reflected in American cities. We'll look at environment, environmental racism, the siting of toxic land uses, exposure to toxics in the environment, and how that breaks down by race, et cetera. We will look at, of course, criminal justice, the war on drugs, how that was created, how it was prosecuted in ways that were directed at communities of color, and in ways that that gave a pass to drug use that was most common in white communities. We will look at the Ferguson phenomenon, or the punitive urbanism, the creation of systems of fines that put low-income people of color into perpetual debt to the local government, which facilitates their incarceration, their inability to meet bail, and how that sort of expands the carceral state and mass incarceration at a local level. We will look at police violence, the community response to that. We are probably going to spend a good deal of time, at least one, if not two sessions, on the idea of defunding the police, what that actually means, what it might look like, how we came to such a point in the public debate. We'll look at where we've placed our freeways. Of course, probably many of you know the story of Rondo and I-94, but there's currently a historical study being done on I-35 as it cut through Minneapolis, and what its impact was as well. Well, that was, those were patterns that were duplicated in city after city after city in the United States. So we'll look at freeway placement. We'll look at transit equity, what that means. We'll look at education and urban design. There is one of those photos on the slide is of Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, which is where all of the monuments to the Confederate Army heroes were placed in Richmond, Virginia, as an example of our iconography in cities, and what that sort of reproduces these ideas of white supremacy, and what's being done about that, or what isn't being done about that in cities across the country as well. Schools obviously are important in this, and we will focus on that as well. So that's how we will approach this. And I'm sorry to have left only 10 minutes for questions, but I'd be glad to, and Rashad as well would be glad to field them at this point.
Thanks so much. One comment from Marcus: much of the white supremacy legacy is baked in to our current system. So his comment is policies need to be systematically rewritten to reduce white supremacy, which is, I'm sure, something you'll talk about, how policy is made and changed in your class. One question: to what extent do you think will the current and continuing trend towards more diversity in the US population automatically reduce white advantage?
Do you want to start, Ed, or?
Go ahead. You can.
Yeah, I don't actually think anything is automatic about it. I don't think that would necessarily produce the result, or a push toward greater racial equality. When you look at the history of whiteness, whiteness is a shifting category that expands, but I think it also has the ability to contract. But white advantage has never been predicated on, I don't think, white majority rule. I think it's been predicated on that political status and the subjectivation of other peoples who don't fall within that category.
So I would generally agree with that, while at the same time arguing that it does hold out hope for a different type of politics going forward, which may be more cognizant of these issues than perhaps we have been in the past, and therefore holding out the possibility for some change.
Thanks. Another comment and question: Stephen shared that he just finished a planning degree at Texas State University, and in capstone classes, they did not talk about racism in urban planning at all. In fact, professors refused to challenge racist comments, and so he's been in talks with his university in trying to make a class like this for the urban and regional planning program happen. Do you have any advice on how to get universities to understand how important this issue is?
So maybe I'm best positioned to answer that, but I will only say that when students unify and go to the faculty or to the administration with strongly held views that have been thought out and demands and requests, we try to respond. Although our course was developed in advance of the George Floyd killing and the events that followed, the students at the Humphrey School have made a similar demand of the Humphrey School that there be more attention to these issues throughout the curriculum, and so to Stephen, I would say that probably acting alone would be difficult, but acting in numbers might bring results, because we've already tried to begin to respond to the demands of our students. Rashad will be teaching a course on reparations in the spring, and that's a direct outcome of these demands that our students have made, and there will be other responses as well. So.
Great, thanks. Another participant shared two questions referring specifically to the slide of the dialectic of planning. What are the factors that influence reform in state planning, and how is control used in state planning?
So the factors that influence reform, if I'm understanding the question right, how does reform present itself, or when can it arise? When is there opportunity for it? If that's the question, I think I would answer speaking from the path dependence literature and the literature on sort of these crises and critical junctures where there's an opportunity for reform. It can be regressive change, or it can be progressive reform. At that moment, it's a matter of which political parties, which political groups really capture that opportunity and shape it to fit their demands. And of course, recognizing that this is a political battle, a contest over ideas, there will be some concessions. Maybe the reform will be, placative, right, in nature, or maybe it will go actually much further than that. But I think that literature actually points to some cues as to how and when progressive reform is possible, or at the same time when regressive change might occur. An example, a ready example might be and Ed can certainly speak to this better than I can, but the change in zoning, the end of single family zoning in Minneapolis. That will be an example of planning's potential for progressive reform. At the state level, I'm not sure, I don't have a ready example, but at least within municipalities, that's a good example, I think.
Yeah,
and how is control, oh, sorry, Ed.
Well, I think our use of the term state here is sort of generic, meaning sort of public sector planning. So.
And how is control used in planning?
Control any number of the mechanisms or the tools that we've just identified, including racial zoning, racial covenants, and restrictive deeds, opportunity hoarding, things that facilitate that opportunity hoarding. And if you look at, another example would be the history of urban renewal, right? The so-called rational decisions that we make on putatively economic terms, right? To go through neighborhoods that are the least resistant, the least economically able to resist, that would be a form of, I think, regressive planning.
I recognize we just have 2 minutes left. We have a couple more questions, so I'll try to get to all of them, but thanks to all of you for submitting questions. From Joan, are we seeing renewed policy trends to maintain white supremacy as diversity grows in the United States?
Well, Joan, I would say, as I hinted at in my remarks, that Trumpism itself is a response to that you're sort of hinting at in your question. As diversity grows in the U.S., the concern and the creation, the emergence of white identity politics, has occurred, and so yes, I do think that that this kind of response is happening. But this is contested terrain, and so I don't think there's any necessary reason why that should prevail in any long or medium term.
Yeah, and I would probably just add to that we have to be cautious of the policies and actions that sometimes look like progress might not actually be progress. Racial capitalism, the broader political economic structure that we study, is very adaptable and able to accommodate the inclusion, at least in representational terms, of people of color, of Black people, of Indigenous people, right? The first elected this or that. But the larger question is, will the material conditions of the Black working class, the Latino working class, Indigenous people, et cetera, be transformed, right? Will there be redress, actual redress beyond the mere symbolic?
And so that's why I think what we do in one of the papers we wrote and what we'll be talking about in the class is then that we need to add a kind of additional layer of analysis onto our public policy issues and our public policy responses to really explicitly ask that question that you are asking, Joan, which is, is this policy going to really make a difference in this framework, or is it not? So.
Awesome. Well, we have arrived at 1 o'clock. I want to say thank you so much to Rashad and Ed for presenting. Thanks to all of our attendees for joining us. Please remember to look at your email tomorrow morning. There will be follow-up there, and we'll have contact for Rashad and Ed in that email as well if you'd like to reach out to them with any other questions, and also the information about how to potentially register for the class if you are interested.
Great. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Okay.